This is the Paltalk News Network.
The views expressed are solely those of the speaker and not necessarily those of Paltalk.com, AVM Software, or its advertisers.
News Talk is online. News Talk Online, a production of Paltalk.com, the largest multimedia interactive program on the internet with more than 4 million unique users on demand on iTunes and on YouTube and on my blog, GaryBaumgarten.com, where you're encouraged to post your comments, whether you agree with yours truly or not. No retribution. And thanks to our good friends at CRN Digital Talk Radio, we are syndicated to an additional 12 million households. I am your host, Gary Baumgarten. I welcome you to the show, and I remind you to please go to paltalknewsnetwork.com often because you will find stories there that you may or may not see in the mainstream media. Some of those we're going to be talking about now with the gentleman to my right, your left, Danny Schechter of the News Dissector.
Pleasure.
I would like to welcome you to my studio, but I'm not. I am invading your offices here at Global Vision.
It's fantastic to see you and to have this technology in one box in a computer that enables us to actually reach out to the entire world and talk to people and get them to talk to us. It's pretty cool.
A lot going on in the news today. I wanted to talk to you specifically not only about something that you wrote about, the freeing of Nelson Mandela, how many years ago?
20 years ago.
20 years ago today?
Well, this week.
20 years ago this week.
The whole scenario unfolded.
Because you were in South Africa covering all that.
No, it wasn't. I was right here in New York covering it, but that's part of the story.
That's part of the story. I also want to talk to you about a piece that we have on, in addition to your piece on the Paltalk News Network site, about a recommendation from the public editor, the ombudsman at the New York Times, that the bureau chief, Jerusalem bureau chief of the New York Times, be removed, reassigned, because his son is now in the Israeli Defense Forces. How can he objectively cover what's going on in Israel with his son in harm's way? But before we get to that, there's a lot of breaking news today. I just want to touch on a couple of things. The space shuttle went up this morning at about 4:15 this morning. We covered it live here on the Paltalk News Network. Most of you were sleeping. Maybe those of you in Europe were watching. It's the second to the last space shuttle flight, and it's the last night launch. It was a beautiful launch. I happen to be an aficionado of the space shuttle program. This president seems to be scuttling any chance of manned space flight in the future with the budget that he has given to Congress or will be giving to Congress. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, can't afford everything. I mean, obviously, the idea of space is not only attractive, but it's also part of our need as people to discover the unknown, to probe into, other universes, to try to understand our universe, to try to find out what we can learn for various applications, scientific, technological, medical, whatever, here at home. So, the idea of a space shuttle, the idea of a space station is something that's always been sort of magical and important. On the other hand, we're in this very deep financial crisis. One of the breaking news stories of the day was that the market dropped below 10,000. There's a great deal of fear about growing debt in Europe, particularly in Greece, which could potentially default. If that happens, there'll be a chain of circumstances. It's what they call contagion. Something happens here, it affects somebody over there. And, the entire future of the Eurozone and ultimately the dollar could be tied to all of this. So there's a lot of anxiety, panic even on Wall Street, and that expressed itself today. So in a sense, there's a lot of uncertainty cutting back on a lot of programs. Now, in Britain, they've trimmed their military budgets, but here in America, not yet. We've expanded ours. So we're, in a situation where we're spending a tremendous amount of money, almost unprecedented amounts of money. That's led to a big debate. The conservatives say we shouldn't do it. The deficit is too high. Liberals and Democrats say not necessarily. We've handled big deficits before, and in fact, look at George Bush's administration. He was a deficit hawk. So there were plenty of, there was a lot of government spending. So there's a debate over all of this, but, the space program doesn't seem to pass the pragmatism test. In other words, we want immediate benefits with everything, and, it's hard to see that in the space program, and so there have been these cutbacks.
My number one cheerleader on my staff for NASA is my producer and show screener on the West Coast, Boaz Frankel. Boaz, do you want to rebut what Danny was just saying?
Rebut.
Well, first of all, hardly a cheerleader, but Danny, good evening to you. Good to have you here. While I agree, Danny, that we can't afford everything, especially in these peril times now economically, I don't think that we can afford to fall behind in what is actually considered to be a background space race. We have to remember that the Chinese are planning to go to the moon, and basically they are they plan on doing a lot of things in order to surpass us. With that respect. Now, it's true that we did land on the moon already, but that's all we did, and brought back a couple 100 pounds of rocks. The Chinese have serious plans for going to the moon in order to do some prospecting there. And this is something that we cannot afford to fall behind on. Besides, without the shuttles, how are we going to get to the International Space Station? At the current time, the only thing we have is the Russian technology, the Soyuz rocket, that will continue to shuttle supplies and astronauts to and from the International Space Station. Now, the question is, do we want to rely that much on the Russians for that? I mean, who knows what's going to happen? I feel, Danny, that President Obama, in his in how he sees things today, is missing a very important point here in our involvement, the United States of America, in the space race, which still exists.
We did have a way of getting into space. It was called LSD. But it's not in wide use.
I agree.
It's not in wide use anymore. But I think, one of the things we have to make is a distinction between the peaceful exploration of space,
Yes.
And the military conquest of space. Behind all of the, great stories about the space shuttle and all the rest, there's been the emergence of a space command in the American military that wants to dominate space. And so so when we talk about rivalry with the Russians and the Chinese, it's not just for the peaceful exploration of space, but there's also a military contest going on, with them pointing to us and saying, look, America is trying to dominate space, space-based